Thank you, Member. Member for Coquitlam-Maillardville.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. Thank you. Thank you to my colleagues. I'm really pleased to be back in the House on this fine fall day, engaging in the work of governing that British Columbians expect of their MLAs, and it's such an honour to be able to bring the voices of all British Columbians to this House in the fall of 2014. Many of my colleagues have remarked that it's been a number of years since this House has had a fall sitting. So I'm pleased to take my place in this debate of this elusive, rare, once-in-a-blue-moon exercise known as a response to a fall throne speech in British Columbia. I thought I would reflect a little bit on what a throne speech means to a government and to the citizens that the government serves. So I thought I would check that really valuable resource known as Wikipedia, just to see if maybe I'd missed anything about what we ought to be expecting from a throne speech and what it's supposed to mean for British Columbians. And I quote from Wikipedia, "The speech from the throne is the oration given before the legislature as part of a lavish affair marking the opening of Parliament. The speech is written by the sitting cabinet, with or without the reader's participation, and outlines the legislative program for the new parliamentary session." It goes on to note that for the legislatures of Australia's states and Canada's provinces, with the exception of Quebec since 1973, and I'll have to do a little bit of research about what that's about, a throne speech is also performed to outline local legislative plans. So the throne speech, if I understand this correctly, is to outline the legislative plans that this government has for our 6-week session. So on October the 6th, we heard an 18-minute speech about the fall legislative session. And the only thing that we heard, certainly the only thing that I heard, that had any legislative substance was about LNG legislation. That's it. 18 minutes of words, and the only thing this government sees fit to address in British Columbia is LNG. So let's start with what we're going to be debating this legislative session, the LNG, and then I'd like to talk about what it is that we're not talking about. So, LNG, debt-free, prosperity fund, 100,000 jobs. Familiar terms. Certainly heard a lot about them about 18 months ago. That was all we heard. The BC Liberals were going to deliver billions of dollars into public coffers. They said they had a plan. The plan involved getting many LNG plants online. In fact, the opportunity was so phenomenal, it was so phenomenal, Honourable Speaker, that we would be able to get rid of the sales tax. I couldn't believe it, get rid of the sales tax. And this was going to be so spectacularly productive that we would also be debt-free. So whenever I hear those words, debt-free, I always have the vision of a bus with those words and oversized letters printed right across it, debt-free. I wonder where that bus is now these days. Where might it be parked? My neighbor over here chuckles at that. I really would love to see it. Move that bus. Let's sort of see, what's on the side of that bus these days. Because we know that debt-free is actually not accurate at all. Under this Premier and her government, they have racked up provincial debt faster than any other Premier in BC's history. By March 2015, the end of this current fiscal year, this Premier and her government will have racked up $18.6 billion in debt. Perhaps the latest slogan ought to be, say one thing, do another. Might not fit quite on the side of a bus. After all, they're only words, and for this government, what it says and what it does are not really connected. In the February throne speech, just 7.5 months ago, the Liberals were standing in this House, paying homage to the February throne speech, and saying that they had to move very fast on this LNG file, that we had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create 100,000 new jobs throughout the province. And there was going to be such a windfall from this industry that it would not only eliminate the provincial debt, the debt which continues to mount, but there would also be a prosperity fund. And this fund was going to take care of all of our problems, kind of like the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, and a unicorn all rolled up in one. Furthermore, they said that on top of laying out an overall framework for LNG that includes taxation, they were going to take specific actions to help make BC's LNG industry the cleanest in the world, and I emphasize the word industry, and there were going to be some very clearly defined First Nations benefits. So what's the reality of what was said in February? And here we are 7 months later, what's going on? So, in the throne speech, the Liberals announced that they would be bringing forward a new LNG tax. Well, back in February 2013, they promised the details were going to follow the following November. Maybe they meant November 2014, because it didn't materialize in 2013, which is when they were committed to bringing it forward. Oh, right, commitments. You don't have to follow through on your commitments. Any November will do. So here we are, a year late, finally getting some legislation on the taxes. So, what have they been doing to get ready? They've been dealing with the industry. They've been spending lots of time talking to industry, and they've been negotiating in public all these months. We have no negotiating position. And we're going to be debating that the rest of this session, and I really look forward to it. The commitment to the cleanest LNG, a promise that was made 7 months ago in the February throne speech, well, now it's a slightly different focus, has a little bit of a different feel to it. Now they say they're choosing, and I quote, to develop the world's cleanest burning non-renewable resource and ship it to the world's fastest growing economy, somehow implying that their actions will contribute in some way to a reduction in the overall GHG emission output made by China, as if this government actually had the power to influence whether or not China even burned coal. Clean Energy Canada makes the point that the province's argument that exported LNG will displace more GHG-intensive fuel sources, such as coal, hinges on a study that has yet to be done and assumes that LNG will displace other fuel sources rather than generate additional capacity. In other words, they don't know. That somehow their legislation is going to address the commitment to have the cleanest LNG industry in the world. So I know that we're going to be debating a bill, but I want to be really clear that the commitment, Honourable Speaker, was to an industry, not to a plant, but to an industry, that we were going to have the cleanest industry. And that's certainly what I'll be looking for when we debate the appropriate bills. So what about their commitment to First Nations? In this last throne speech, and I quote, leadership means developing a real partnership with First Nations and giving them the opportunity to participate meaningfully in a thriving economy. So what does that mean to First Nations? There's no commitment in this throne speech. There's certainly a lot of words that have the right tone. But given how readily this government changes its commitments, I don't believe there's a plan to work in partnership, given that there's nothing in this throne speech for the First Nations of this province, nothing to demonstrate a commitment to partnership. This Premier, Honourable Speaker, and her government love to tell people what they think they want to hear. But certainly First Nations leaders are wise to this strategy. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, he called the Premier's address on First Nations reconciliation this past September, and I quote, powerful platitudes. And Grand Chief Edward John on the First Nations Summit said, and I quote, in the past, what we've been met with is mostly forked tongues. We can't have that again. The courts have set the new course for First Nations in this province, Honourable Speaker. And while the Premier and the Liberal government can say the right words, we know that their willingness and commitment and follow-through is considerably weak. Now, the throne speech also talked about leadership in the area of local government, noting wanting local governments to control spending, find savings, and balance budgets. That these are expectations of local government. I have no idea where the Premier has been, but local governments are bound by legislation, Honourable Speaker. They're bound by legislation to balance their budgets. And all the local governments that I know do just that. They also control spending and look for savings, but I will tell you that when you have other levels of government getting out of the business of caring for citizens, it's local governments that feel the pinch. When the federal government got out of the business of housing or providing tax incentives to developers to build rental housing, it was local governments who had to deal with street homelessness and other forms of homelessness. When the BC Liberals failed to properly produce community-based treatments for those with mental illness, it was municipalities that had to pick up the slack with added police force services. And now that the BC Ambulance Service has downgraded 70 types of calls, the burden of responding to these emergencies is once again falling to local government firefighters, a burden once again that is falling to local governments. We also see Emergency Management BC has changed their mission statement, Honourable Speaker. So instead of the province taking leadership in the event of an earthquake, the expectation is for municipalities to actually take the leadership, and the province will take a back seat. I don't see any money flow to these municipalities for these new responsibilities, Honourable Speaker. Once again, we have a premier that knows exactly what to say, but then does what she wants. I mean, it does sound really good to say these things, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. A government that says to local governments, you need to control your spending and find savings, and by the way, you also need to provide these additional services, and we aren't going to give you money to do it. If this isn't crazy-making, Honourable Speaker, I don't know what is. And of course, while this government once talked about working 24/7 to bring labor peace with teachers, we saw the longest labor disruption in history. The real impact of this disruption will be felt for a long time. Teachers who had to borrow money to pay their mortgages, families scrambled to find childcare, students anxious about catching up on their studies, school boards now having to deal with clawbacks after having been promised that they could keep 20% of the dollars saved from the days that the schools were closed. This government took this summer off because they wanted to send a message. So while they were mouthing the words, "We will work 24/7, their actions said, "We need to teach those teachers a lesson, let them suffer. So much for working 24/7. So what else does this government say? It would seem that the BC Liberals, Honourable Speaker, they like to say things in order to win an election, and then they just don't deliver. So before there was debt-free BC, it was families first. Now this one was my favorite. It's a good slogan. The alliteration is just really elegant. But the F in families first really belongs to the BC Liberals. It's their letter grade they deserve for their inability or their lack of willingness to follow through on their commitments. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in this throne speech that supports families. Nothing about those disgusting clawbacks that have been making life harder on single mothers on disability. Nothing about those other clawbacks that foster children have to endure now that post-secondary institutions have offered bursaries to these young people. Nothing for healthcare that consumes 40% of our healthcare budget. I guess under the new slogan of out with the old, in with the new, they no longer believe they have to live up to these other commitments. Now, the Liberals did mention that the opportunity, and I quote again, "The opportunity afforded by LNG is more than a chance to make a smart investment. It's the expanded patient care tower in Victoria and the one planned in Vernon. It's Cordabin Lodge in Prince George, giving Northern cancer patients a place to recover closer to their families. Really lovely. Promising these already announced plans, but nothing about anything specific to address a single health policy, program, or legislation. No mention of seniors, no mention of mental health, no mention of northern or rural health, no mention of any platform promises or past government promises such as a provincial mental health strategy, addiction resources, family doctor strategy, or hospice expansion. No mention of a violence-free BC. And I actually really like that slogan. I was actually really excited to hear that slogan in the February throne speech. It didn't catch on, though. We only heard it once in February. No new programs, new money to actually do something to protect women trapped in the cycle of violence. And of course, there was nothing for the perpetrators of violence, usually men who need to understand the impact that violence has on their families. These slogans can be very, very powerful. They can be catchy, easy sound bites that fit on the side of a bus. But this government changes its slogans the way I like to change my wardrobe, Honorable Speaker. Out with the old and in with the new. Oh, that was so last season. I'm not wearing that old thing. I need something new to freshen up the look. I guess they'll have to find a catchy new slogan this fall that would carry them through the season, the sitting. This is the thinking that I have been witnessing over the last year and a half. And sadly, this is the kind of government we have. We have a slogans are us government. They love the slogans and the messaging, that when you read the fine print, it all just falls apart. There's nothing that describes when and what they are going to deliver. And that's because, Honorable Speaker, they don't have anything to deliver. My constituents are looking for a whole bunch of things. I think back to my days knocking on doors back in April and May of 2013. And I recall, and I talked about this family in my response to the February throne speech. I knocked on this door. It was Sunday afternoon, late in the day, and a woman appeared at the door. She was preparing dinner because she had a knife in her hand, and she was waving it around. And she was pretty angry. Both she and her husband had employment, but they weren't really getting any further ahead. They didn't have any access to childcare that would be affordable for her, so that she didn't have to pick up evening and weekend shifts, because that was really how she was making ends meet, working extra shifts, evenings and weekends, therefore wasn't with her family. They didn't have easy access to transit that would minimize their need for a second vehicle. And they didn't have time to be together as a family. And there was nothing in this throne speech, there was nothing in February's throne speech that would make a difference to this woman and her family. I heard from other families more recently, one that sort of stands out, that is about health care. This is a constituent whose 90-year-old mother fell, and she broke a hip. And we all know that when 90-year-olds fall and break hips, it's usually not very good outcomes. But this woman is actually pretty much a tough cookie. And she survived the broken hip. But part of the outcome of falling and hurting herself is that she suffers from extreme anxiety, and she's really afraid to be alone. And the assessment was made that she ought not to live alone, and that her level of care is increasing. And so while she was in hospital, she was told not to worry, we'll find her a bed. And so her daughter, my constituent, said, that's great, really excited to hear that. And she proceeded to sell off her mother's furniture, keep a few things that she can take with her into care. She let go of her mother's apartment, only to be told 6 weeks later, oh, we can't find a bed. Your mom's going to have to move out, and we'll get her some home care support. We'll get her like a couple of hours a day. Well, this woman was having panic and anxiety attacks at all hours of the day. This woman was afraid to get off the bed. This woman was afraid to walk independently. She's 90 years old, and now she had no home. And now the message that she was getting from the caring doctors and nurses was that we have no room for you to go to. So what is a person to do? What do I tell my constituent? This is a government that isn't ready to respond because all they care about right now is LNG. That's all we're seeing, that's all we're discussing. Honorable Speaker, Coquitlam-Maillardville citizens and British Columbians deserve better. They deserve a caring government that provides services designed to support all British Columbians throughout the province. They deserve a government that will provide them with the tools that they need to flourish. They need a government that will properly fund education. The earlier speaker from Burnaby North talked about the ACIP program. It's a great program. But I've been talking to teachers who said, I don't have enough equipment, or I have 30 students and 15 pieces of equipment, and I don't have enough eyes to make sure that everyone is safe. I need a smaller class size. That's not acceptable. So you can have all these fabulous ideas, but if you don't invest in making sure that it's done properly, then you fail. You fail on a families first agenda. You fail on taking care of citizens. You fail on a debt-free agenda. You fail on a violence-free agenda. Slogans do not cut it. So, Honorable Speaker, I'd like to say that I'd like to be able to say that I'd liked something in the throne speech, that there was something that stood out that said, this is something that really will make a difference. This is something that will really make life better for British Columbians. This is a government that has yet to deliver, Honourable Speaker, and that's disappointing. Thank you.